The autumn wind carried more than dust through Dodge City that October night in 1886. It carried the acrid smell of smoke and the screams of a woman who would never see another dawn. Martha Henderson's barn blazed like a beacon against the Kansas darkness, flames licking 30 feet into the star-scattered sky. The volunteer fire brigade worked frantically with their hand-pumped engine, but everyone knew it was too late. The structure groaned and cracked, sending sparks dancing across the prairie like angry fireflies. "Stand back! She's coming down!" Sheriff Tom Bradley shouted, his weathered face illuminated by the orange glow. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." The lonely rancher stood apart from the crowd, as he always did. At 42, he was a man carved from the same hard earth he worked, lean, weathered, with eyes the color of storm clouds. Most folks in Dodge City knew him only as the quiet man who ran cattle on the land east of town, who came to church but never stayed for fellowship, who paid his bills in cash and kept his own counsel. Tonight, something was different. While others watched the spectacle, his attention was drawn to a small figure huddled near the water trough behind the burning structure. A boy, maybe 8 years old, sat trembling in clothes too big for his frame, his dark hair singed at the edges. "Hey there, son," the rancher called softly, approaching with the careful movements of a man accustomed to spooked animals. "You hurt?" The boy looked up with eyes wide as saucers, clutching something silver in his small fist. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Soot streaked his pale cheeks like war paint. "Martha. Where's Martha?" "Mrs. Eleanor Whitman," the banker's wife, pushed through the crowd, her usual composure cracking. Someone said she was in there when it started. The fire chief, a burly German named Klaus Mueller, removed his hat. "Found her inside, ma'am. I'm sorry." She didn't make it out. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered townspeople. Martha Henderson had been a fixture in Dodge City for 15 years, ever since her husband died in a cattle drive accident. She'd run her small spread with the determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. "What about the boy?" Dr. Samuel Morrison stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Someone said there was a child." The rancher looked down at the trembling figure beside him. "He's here. Seems unharmed, but he's in shock." "That's not Martha's boy," said Reverend Jonathan Hayes, squinting in the firelight. "Martha never had children." "Who is he?" Murmurs began to spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, a strange child was cause for suspicion. "Maybe he's one of them orphan train kids," suggested Pete Kowalski, the blacksmith. "Heard tell they've been dropping them off in towns all along the railroad." "Or maybe he's a runaway," added Mrs. Whitman, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Could be he started that fire." The rancher felt the boy press closer to his leg. "Now hold on," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "This child's been through enough tonight without folks pointing fingers." "But where did he come from?" pressed Reverend Hayes. "And why was he at Martha's place?" Before anyone could answer, old Silas Crow pushed forward on his walking stick. At 78, Silas had seen more than his share of tragedy in Dodge City, and his weathered face bore the lines of a man who believed in omens. "I seen this before," he wheezed, pointing a gnarled finger at the boy. "Back in 71, when the Miller place burned. Strange child showed up then, too. Within a week, 3 more fires broke out. Folks said he was cursed." "That's superstitious nonsense," Dr. Morrison interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Silas's eyes glittered in the firelight. "Martha's well went bitter 3 days ago. Cattle been acting spooked all week. And now this." He gestured toward the smoldering ruins. "Mark my words, that boy brings bad luck." The crowd began to murmur more loudly now, fear creeping into their voices like poison in a water well. The rancher could feel the mood shifting, the way a herd could turn from calm to stampede in a heartbeat. "The boy needs food and shelter," he said firmly. "He's coming with me." "Now wait just a minute." Sheriff Bradley stepped forward. "We don't know anything about this child. Could be he's wanted somewhere. Could be he's just a scared kid who needs help, the rancher interrupted. I'm taking him to my place. Anyone has a problem with that can take it up with me tomorrow. He knelt down beside the boy, his voice gentle. What's your name, son? The child's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he managed, Tommy. Well, Tommy, I'm going to take you somewhere safe. That all right with you? The boy nodded, still clutching the silver object in his fist. As the rancher lifted Tommy onto his horse, he could hear the whispers starting behind him. By morning, he knew, those whispers would become accusations. In a town still trying to shake off its wild reputation, fear spread faster than prairie fire. But as he rode toward his ranch with the boy clinging to his back, the rancher couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than a simple barn fire. The way Tommy had been positioned behind the building, the silver object he refused to release, the timing of Martha's death, it all felt too convenient, too planned. In Dodge City, coincidences were as rare as honest politicians, and the lonely rancher had learned long ago that when something seemed too convenient, it usually was. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over Dodge City, casting long shadows across the smoldering remains of Martha Henderson's barn. The lonely rancher stood on his porch, coffee cup in hand, watching the smoke still rising in the distance. Beside him, Tommy sat on the wooden steps, finally clean after a hot bath and wearing clothes that actually fit, hand-me-downs the rancher had kept from his younger days. The boy hadn't spoken much since the night before, but he'd eaten 3 helpings of beans and cornbread and slept without nightmares. That was something, at least. "Rider coming," Tommy said suddenly, his young eyes sharper than the rancher's weathered ones. Sure enough, a dust cloud was approaching from town. As it drew closer, the rancher could make out Sheriff Bradley's familiar figure, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode Judge Harrison Caldwell, the most powerful man in Ford County, and Reverend Hayes. "Trouble," the rancher muttered, setting down his coffee. The 3 men reined in their horses at the gate. Judge Caldwell, a portly man in his 60s with silver whiskers and expensive clothes, dismounted with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to ranch life. "Morning, rancher," Sheriff Bradley called out, his tone formal. "We need to talk." "I figured you might." The rancher stepped down from the porch, positioning himself between the visitors and Tommy. "What's on your mind?" Judge Caldwell cleared his throat importantly. "It's about the boy. There's been developments." "What kind of developments?" Reverend Hayes spoke up, his usually kind face creased with worry. 3 more wells have gone bad since last night. The Kowalski place, the Murphy farm, and worst of all, the town well behind the church. The water tastes like sulfur and makes the livestock sick, and folks are saying it started when the boy arrived, Sheriff Bradley added reluctantly. "They're calling it a curse." The rancher's jaw tightened. "Water wells don't go bad because of curses. There's always a natural explanation." "Maybe so," Judge Caldwell said, "but the people of Dodge City are frightened. They want answers, and they want them now." "What kind of answers?" "They want to know who the boy is, where he came from, and why he was at Martha's place when it burned." The judge's voice carried the weight of authority. "And they want to know why you're so determined to protect him." Tommy had gone very still on the porch steps, his small hands clenched into fists. The rancher could see the fear in the boy's eyes, the same look he'd seen in cornered animals. "Because he's a child," the rancher said simply. "And children deserve protection." "Even cursed children?" The voice came from behind the mounted men. More riders were approaching, a dozen townspeople led by Silas Crow and Mrs. Whitman. Their faces were hard with fear and suspicion. "There's no such thing as cursed children," the rancher replied, but his hand instinctively moved closer to the Colt .45 on his hip. Mrs. Whitman urged her horse forward. "My husband's cattle started dying this morning. Just dropped dead in the pasture for no reason. And the Kowalski baby has been crying nonstop since midnight. That boy brought evil to our town." "The boy brought nothing but trouble," agreed Silas Crow. "Hand him over, rancher. Let us deal with this proper." "And how would you deal with it?" The rancher's voice was dangerously quiet. The old man's eyes glittered with malice. "Same way we dealt with problems in the old days, quick and permanent." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. The rancher could feel Tommy trembling behind him, could hear the boy's quick, frightened breathing. Judge Caldwell raised his hand for silence. "Now let's not talk about taking the law into our own hands. We're civilized people here." He paused, studying the rancher's face. "But the people have a right to answers. I'm calling for a citizen's trial." "A trial?" The rancher couldn't hide his surprise. "For what crime?" "Suspicion of arson, for starters," the judge replied. "And if the boy really is cursed, well, the town has a right to protect itself." Sheriff Bradley looked uncomfortable. "Judge, the boy's just 8 years old. Even if he did start that fire, age doesn't matter when it comes to supernatural evil," Mrs. Whitman interrupted. "Everyone knows children can be vessels for dark forces." The rancher had heard enough. "You want a trial? Fine. But it'll be a real trial with real evidence, not superstitious nonsense." "Agreed." Judge Caldwell nodded. "Tomorrow at noon, in the church hall. You'll have until then to prove the boy's innocence. And if I can't?" The judge's expression was grim. "Then the town will decide his fate." As the group prepared to leave, Silas Crow spat into the dust. "Mark my words, rancher. That boy's brought a curse on all of us, and curses have a way of spreading to those who harbor them." After the riders disappeared back toward town, the rancher sat down beside Tommy on the porch steps. The boy was shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. "They want to hurt me," Tommy whispered. "Not while I'm breathing," the rancher replied firmly. "But I need your help, son. I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night. Everything." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, then slowly opened his clenched fist. In his palm lay a silver cufflink, ornate and expensive, with an engraved family crest, a lion rampant surrounded by wheat stalks. "I found this," Tommy said quietly, "in the barn before the fire started." The rancher examined the cufflink carefully. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the kind of thing only the wealthiest men in the territory could afford. And the family crest. He'd seen it before, but where? "Tommy, I need you to think hard. Do you remember anything else? Any sounds, any smells, anything at all?" The boy screwed up his face in concentration. "There was a man," he said finally. "Before the fire. I was hiding in the hayloft and I heard voices. A man and Miss Martha. They were arguing." "What were they arguing about?" "Water," Tommy said. "The man kept saying she had to sell, that she couldn't fight it anymore. Miss Martha said she'd never sell, not to him, not to anybody." The rancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Water rights were serious business in Kansas worth killing for. And if Martha Henderson had been murdered for her land, did you see the man's face? Tommy shook his head. It was dark, but he had a fancy voice, like the preacher, and he smelled like pipe tobacco and bay rum. Bay rum cologne was expensive, another sign of wealth. The rancher was beginning to see the outline of something much larger than a simple barn fire. "Tommy, this is very important. When did you find the cufflink?" "Right after the man left. It was on the ground near the ladder to the hayloft. I picked it up and then—" Tommy's voice trailed off. "Then what?" "Then everything started burning." The rancher stood up, his mind racing. Someone had murdered Martha Henderson and burned her barn to cover the evidence. Someone wealthy enough to wear silver cufflinks and bay rum cologne. Someone who wanted Martha's water rights badly enough to kill for them. And now that same someone was using the town's superstitions to eliminate the only witness, an 8-year-old boy who couldn't even properly identify his attacker. But the cufflink was evidence, real evidence. And in less than 24 hours, the rancher would have to use it to save Tommy's life. The question was, would it be enough? The morning sun climbed higher over Dodge City as the lonely rancher saddled his horse with grim determination. Tommy sat nearby, still clutching the silver cufflink like a talisman against the evil that seemed to surround them. "I want you to stay here," the rancher told him. "Lock the doors, and don't open them for anyone but me. Understand?" Tommy nodded solemnly. "Where are you going?" "To find the truth." The rancher checked his rifle one more time. "And to make sure you live to see another sunrise." His first stop was the blacksmith shop, where Pete Kowalski was shoeing a horse despite the early hour. The big Polish immigrant looked up as the rancher approached, his face grim. "Heard about the trial," Pete said without preamble. "Folks are worked up something fierce. My Anna's been crying all morning, convinced that boy's going to curse our baby." "Pete, I need you to look at something." The rancher pulled out the cufflink. "Ever seen anything like this before?" The blacksmith wiped his hands on his leather apron and examined the piece carefully. His eyes widened as he recognized the craftsmanship. "This is expensive work," he said slowly. "Real silver, hand-engraved. See this crest? That's not local work. This came from back east, maybe Chicago or St. Louis. Anyone in town wealthy enough to own something like this?" Pete's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, there's Judge Caldwell, of course, and Mr. Nathaniel Worthington. He owns the biggest ranch in the county. Then there's—" He stopped suddenly, his face paling. "Who, Pete?" "Mr. Charles Blackwood. He's been buying up land all around here, making offers folks can't refuse. Word is he's got backing from some big cattle syndicate back east." The rancher knew the name. Charles Blackwood had arrived in Dodge City 6 months ago with more money than sense and a hunger for land that seemed insatiable. He'd been pressuring small ranchers and farmers to sell, always offering just enough to make it tempting but never enough to make it fair. "Has Blackwood been after Martha Henderson's place?" Pete nodded reluctantly. "Been after her water rights something fierce. That spring on her land feeds half the wells in this part of the county. Control that, and you control the water supply for miles around." The pieces were starting to fit together. The rancher thanked Pete and rode toward the Henderson place, his mind working through the implications. If Blackwood had killed Martha for her water rights, he'd need to make sure no one could challenge his claim to the land. At the burned-out barn, the rancher dismounted and began searching the area methodically. The fire had been hot and fast, destroying most evidence, but fires always left traces for those who knew how to look. Near the back of the barn, he found what he was looking for, a small glass bottle, partially melted but still recognizable. He picked it up carefully, noting the acrid smell that still clung to it. Kerosene. Someone had used it to accelerate the fire. But it was what he found next that made his blood run cold. Hidden under a pile of charred timber, he discovered a small leather pouch containing papers. Most were too damaged to read, but one document had survived. A deed transfer, already signed by Martha Henderson but not yet witnessed or filed. The deed transferred all of Martha's land and water rights to Charles Blackwood for the sum of $1. "Forgery," the rancher muttered. Martha Henderson would never have sold her land for $1, especially not to Blackwood. Someone had prepared this document in advance, planning to file it after Martha's death and claim she'd sold the land before the fire. His next stop was the telegraph office, where operator Jim Morrison, Dr. Morrison's younger brother, was just opening for the day. "Jim, I need to ask you about any telegrams sent last night or this morning." The young man looked nervous. "I don't know if I should—" "A boy's life is at stake," the rancher said firmly. "And if I'm right, a woman was murdered last night." Jim's face went white. "Murdered? But everyone says it was an accident, or maybe the curse—" "There's no curse, Jim, just greed and murder. Now about those telegrams." Reluctantly, Jim pulled out his logbook. "There was one, sent around midnight. Came from Mr. Blackwood's hotel room." "What did it say?" "It was addressed to someone in Chicago. Said, 'Package delivered. Deed will be filed tomorrow. Proceed with next phase.'" The rancher felt a chill of certainty. Blackwood hadn't just killed Martha Henderson, he was part of a larger conspiracy to seize land throughout the county. And Tommy was the only witness who could expose the truth. "Jim, I need you to send a telegram for me to the county clerk in Topeka. Ask them to hold any deed transfers involving Martha Henderson's property until further notice." "But Mr. Blackwood said he'd be filing papers this afternoon." "That's exactly why we need to stop him." The rancher's final stop was the hotel where Blackwood was staying. The desk clerk, a nervous young man named Billy, confirmed that Blackwood had left early that morning for the county seat. "Said he had important business to conduct," Billy added. "Seemed in a powerful hurry." "What room was he in?" "Room 12, but he's checked out." The rancher was already heading for the stairs. "I need to see that room." "Sir, I can't let you—" The look in the rancher's eyes stopped Billy's protest cold. "A boy's life depends on what I find in that room. You can help me, or you can explain to Sheriff Bradley why you obstructed justice." Room 12 had been hastily cleaned, but the rancher's experienced eyes caught what the hotel staff had missed. In the wastebasket, he found several crumpled papers, drafts of the forged deed, practice signatures, and most damning of all, a letter from a Chicago cattle syndicate outlining their plan to acquire water rights throughout western Kansas. But it was what he found under the bed that sealed Blackwood's fate: a second silver cufflink, identical to the one Tommy had found, and a bottle of bay rum cologne. As the rancher rode back to his ranch, his mind was already working on how to present this evidence at the trial. He had proof of murder, forgery, and conspiracy, but would it be enough to overcome the town's superstitious fears? When he arrived home, he found Tommy exactly where he'd left him, sitting on the porch with the doors locked behind him. But the boy's face was pale with fresh terror. "What's wrong, son?" A man came by. Tommy whispered. "He said if you didn't hand me over by tonight, bad things would happen to you too. He said the curse would spread to anyone who helped me." The rancher knelt down beside the boy. "Tommy, listen to me carefully. There is no curse. What happened to Martha Henderson wasn't supernatural. It was murder, and the man who killed her is trying to use the town's fear to cover up his crime. But the wells can be poisoned by a man with the right chemicals, just like a barn can be burned with kerosene." The rancher showed Tommy the evidence he'd collected. "This is what really happened, and tomorrow we're going to prove it." Tommy looked at the papers and bottles with wide eyes. "Will they believe you?" "They'll have to," the rancher said grimly, "because if they don't, we're both dead men." As the sun began to set over Dodge City, painting the sky the color of blood, the lonely rancher prepared for the fight of his life. Tomorrow, he would face down not just one man's greed, but an entire town's fear. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, Charles Blackwood was riding back from the county seat, confident that his plan was working perfectly. He had no idea that his carefully constructed web of lies was about to unravel, one thread at a time. The church hall had never held so many people. Every pew was packed, with more folks standing along the walls and spilling out onto the front steps. The air was thick with tension, and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain that the drought-stricken land desperately needed. Judge Caldwell sat behind a makeshift bench at the front of the hall, his gavel ready to maintain order in what promised to be anything but an orderly proceeding. To his right sat the town's most prominent citizens, Mrs. Whitman, Reverend Hayes, and notably Charles Blackwood, who had returned from the county seat just an hour before the trial began. The lonely rancher entered with Tommy at his side, the boy's small hand gripping his tightly. A murmur ran through the crowd, some sympathetic, others hostile. Old Silas Crow spat loudly into a brass spittoon, his contempt clear. "This trial will determine the fate of the boy known as Tommy," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice carrying over the whispers. "The charges are suspicion of arson and supernatural malfeasance." "Your Honor," the rancher stood up, his voice steady despite the odds against him. "Before we proceed, I have evidence that will change everything about this case." Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand moving instinctively to his shirt cuff where a silver cufflink should have been. "Present your evidence," the judge said. The rancher walked to the front of the hall, Tommy beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been told this boy is cursed. You've been told he brought evil to our town. But what if I told you that everything that's happened, the fire, the poisoned wells, even Martha Henderson's death, was the work of a man, not a curse? Preposterous," Mrs. Whitman called out. "We've all seen the signs." "Yes, you have," the rancher agreed. "But you've seen what someone wanted you to see." He held up the kerosene bottle. "This was used to start the fire at Martha's barn. Kerosene doesn't ignite by supernatural means. It requires a human hand." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. That could have come from anywhere. Could have. The rancher nodded. But this couldn't. He produced the forged deed. This is a document transferring Martha Henderson's land to Charles Blackwood for $1, supposedly signed before her death. A gasp ran through the crowd. Blackwood's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. That's impossible. I never— You never what? Mr. Blackwood never killed Martha Henderson, never forged her signature, never planned to steal her water rights? The rancher's voice cut through the hall like a blade. This is outrageous! Blackwood stood up, his face flushed with anger. I won't sit here and listen to these wild accusations. Then perhaps you'd like to explain this. The rancher held up the second silver cufflink. Tommy found the mate to this in Martha's barn the night she died. Funny thing about expensive cufflinks, they come in pairs. Blackwood's hand flew to his cuff, confirming what everyone could now see. One of his cufflinks was missing. That proves nothing, he sputtered. I could have lost it anywhere. Could have, the rancher agreed again, but you didn't lose it anywhere. You lost it when you murdered Martha Henderson. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel for order. Furthermore, the rancher continued, the poisoned wells aren't the result of a curse. They're the result of deliberate contamination. He produced a small vial of clear liquid. Sulfur compounds, probably introduced through the wellheads under cover of darkness. Easy enough to do if you know what you're doing. Pete Kowalski stood up from the back of the hall. My well's been acting strange for days, and I did see someone near it 2 nights ago, but I figured it was just a drifter. What did this person look like? The rancher asked. Tall, well-dressed, smelled like fancy cologne. All eyes turned to Blackwood, who was now sweating despite the cool air in the hall. This is all circumstantial, Judge Caldwell said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? The rancher pulled out the telegram log. Mr. Blackwood sent a telegram last night to his associates in Chicago, confirming that the package had been delivered and that the deed would be filed today. Jim Morrison can confirm this. The telegraph operator stood up reluctantly. It's true, Your Honor. I sent the telegram myself. And here, the rancher continued, producing the letter from the Chicago Syndicate, is proof that Mr. Blackwood is part of a larger conspiracy to seize water rights throughout western Kansas. Martha Henderson wasn't his first victim. She was just the most recent. The crowd was growing restless now, their fear turning to anger as they realized they'd been manipulated. But what about the boy? Mrs. Whitman demanded. How do you explain his presence at the scene? Tommy stepped forward, his young voice clear in the sudden silence. I was hiding, he said. I've been living in barns and sheds since my ma died. Miss Martha, she found me in her hayloft 3 days ago. She said I could stay if I helped with chores. Why didn't you tell anyone? Reverend Hayes asked gently. Because I was scared, Tommy replied. I heard the man arguing with Miss Martha. He said she had to sell or something bad would happen to her. When I found his cufflink after he left, I knew he'd done something terrible. The boy's lying, Blackwood shouted desperately. He's in league with dark forces. Look at what's happened since he arrived. What's happened, the rancher said quietly, is that a greedy man murdered an innocent woman and tried to use superstition to cover his tracks. At that moment, Sheriff Bradley burst through the doors of the hall, his face grim. Judge, I just got word from the county clerk. Mr. Blackwood tried to file a deed this morning, but when they examined it, they found evidence of forgery. There's also a warrant out for his arrest in connection with similar crimes in 3 other counties. The hall erupted in chaos. Blackwood made a desperate break for the door, but Pete Kowalski and 2 other men blocked his path. In the struggle, a small vial fell from Blackwood's coat pocket, shattering on the floor and releasing the unmistakable smell of sulfur. The poison for the wells, Dr. Morrison said grimly. As Sheriff Bradley placed Blackwood in shackles, the man's composure finally cracked. You don't understand, he screamed. There's millions of dollars at stake. The railroad's coming through, and whoever controls the water controls everything. And you were willing to kill for it, the rancher said, quietly. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel one final time. Case dismissed. The boy is innocent of all charges. As the crowd began to disperse, many stopping to apologize to Tommy and the rancher, Mrs. Whitman approached with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "We let our fears make us forget our humanity." "Fear's a powerful thing," the rancher replied, "but so is courage. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up for what's right." That evening, as the promised rain finally began to fall on the parched Kansas earth, the lonely rancher sat on his porch with Tommy beside him. The boy was no longer clutching the silver cufflink. It was evidence in Sheriff Bradley's custody now. "What happens to me now?" Tommy asked. The rancher was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain wash the dust from his land. "Well," he said finally, "I've got a ranch that could use an extra hand, and you've got nowhere else to go. Seems like a fair arrangement." Tommy smiled for the first time since the rancher had known him. "You mean I can stay?" "Long as you want, son. Long as you want." As the rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of smoke from Martha Henderson's barn, Dodge City began to heal. The wells would be cleaned, the land would recover, and a community that had nearly lost its soul to fear had found it again in the courage of one man and the innocence of one child. And in a small ranch house east of town, a lonely man was no longer quite so alone. "Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.